Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second episode of the Green Alliance Election Countdown webinar series. My name is Brazier Tope, and I am Head of Politics here at Green Alliance. This episode is going to talk about the politics of the day, of which there is a lot. What we're likely to see in the spring budget in a couple of weeks' time, how manifestos are shaping up, with obviously all parties are currently ramping up their processes, and how all of this fits into the wider climate and nature agenda in what is a pivotal election year. I've got some really great speakers joining me today. So just a quick intro to them is star of the show. We've got Lizzy Buchan, who is Deputy Political Editor at The Mirror. We've also got Sam Alvis, who's Director of Energy and Environment at Public First, Steve Coulter, Head of Economy at Green Alliance, and Jess Ralston, Head of Energy at ECIU. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you can put any questions you've got that you want to ask any of the panelists in the Q&A function, not in the comments, because I won't be able to look at them, I'll incorporate as many as I can to the discussion. And if we've got time for a proper Q&A, if there are loads that haven't been answered at the end, that'd be great. And you can upvote those if there are particular things you agree with that other people have said, rather than saying it again. Right, first things first, I want to kick off with Lizzy. It has been, I think, safe to say, a fairly disastrous few weeks for both major parties. Obviously, Labour, comms chaos around the 28 billion, which felt like it just went on, swiftly moving to chaos of the Rochdale by-election, meant Labour was dominating the news in what probably should have been a fairly terrible few weeks for the government. Obviously then, on the government side, two very heavy losses in by-elections, and the UK officially entered a recession, and there's obviously this ongoing stuff about plotting within their own party about trying to remove Sunak before the next election. There is just almost an unfathomable amount to try and keep on top of. But what do you think it means? Where has all of this left us?
I think what's been really interesting is we're basically just in an election campaign, just a really, really long one. And the fact that we don't know when the election's going to be has kind of created this very weird atmosphere where everybody's in Westminster certainly is sort of working at a million miles an hour. Everyone's really pushing themselves, really everything feels very high stakes, but actually we could be doing this for months and months and months. So what we've seen recently, I think, is just a taste of what the campaign's going to be like. We've seen a real uptick in the kinds of online attacks between the parties. We've seen some quite interesting dirty tricks going on. The Rochdale by-election story has had some quite interesting sort of fallout, and obviously the way it emerged was quite strange. And I think we think that the recording from the councillor Azhar Ali, who now is standing as an independent candidate, was sort of obtained by Conservative Party, given to Mail on Sunday. There's some quite interesting stuff going on behind the scenes, and everybody's all in to play for the next election. So I think that's kind of the backdrop to what's going on at the moment. And obviously the stakes are feeling increasingly high, as for the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak's been promising for more than a year that he can try and turn things around, that he can narrow the poll lead, which has been fairly consistent for more than a year, with Labour sometimes double-digit figures lead over the Conservatives. Rishi Sunak's been promising every time he says, oh no, this is going to be the moment where we turn things around. No, this is. And the pressure is getting more and more from within his own party and outside to really, to prove that actually he is able to do that. It doesn't seem like he can at the moment. And then on the other side, you've got Labour, who have this huge poll lead, which is a blessing and a curse. And they are very much sort of trying to tread this line of being cautious, not being too cautious. Everyone's very nervous about being the person that messes it up. And so it creates tensions on both sides.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such an interesting context to where we're at. And I mean, just to delve a bit more, I mean, do you have a sense of, where the polls are now and where you'd expect them to go? Is it just, naturally, do you think they will close as we get close to an election? And also, on the date of the election, you say we don't know, but what's the kind of feeling in the lobby? Is it that it probably are looking at an autumn election rather than May, given we're getting pretty close?
I think you would expect to see the polls narrow, certainly, and I think that's going to be it's going to be really instructive to see how Labour handle that, how whether they can hold their nerve on some of this or not, because you have a lot of people within the Labour Party who are very good, very experienced, but the last time we had a Labour government was quite a long time ago. There's not that many people who were ministers, who were special advisors. They've brought in people with some of that experience, but there's a lot of people who don't have any idea what it's like to be in government. And, I think they've done a lot to turn things around since 2019. But I sometimes think, the impression that a few journalists have been talking about, and I've certainly thought, is that perhaps they're not quite ready for what's coming, about how intense it's going to be. The level of scrutiny is already rising hugely because people are taking them seriously. That's a good thing. But I think they have to be, they're going to how they deal with all of the challenges that are going to come, the kind of negative stories, the fighting, the briefing that just happens in politics, whether they're able to kind of keep going, keep their cool over it is going to be, that could be a real factor in how this plays out. And the timing of the election will also have a huge bearing on it. I mean, there are lots of schools of thought about when it could be. I wouldn't bet against May, even, the government says November. Everyone's preparing for May, and I think you have to prepare for May. And it's kind of this, at the moment, there's sort of an attempt to sort of psych each other out quite a lot of the time. You never quite know who's briefing what and for what purpose. There were stories the other week about how possibly the government might go in October rather than going at the same time as the American presidential election, for sort of the security reason of having two Five Eyes countries having an election at the same time. Obviously, that creates quite a lot of insecurity. But, why, if once they started briefing October, I sort of thought, well, maybe it means actually they want us to think it's October, maybe it's going to be May. So the only thing I would say is, from sort of reading the runes, you can see that Conservatives are spending a lot of money on online attack ads. They're spending a lot of money on advertising on Facebook. And the government has also got the civil service to start doing opposition costings of Labour policies, all of which are things I would expect to see I was expecting an election sooner rather than later. So all bets are off, but I wouldn't bet the house on November. I'd keep an open mind for it to come in the spring.
Okay, really interesting, really useful. I mean, in terms of the inexperience you're talking about, I think lots of people have made the connection between that and like just going back to the 28 billion a bit and what happened around that and how long it went on for, like the briefing to and from. And it was like, there's so many questions about whether Labour were letting the media do that or if it was the Conservatives that were pushing that all the time. What's your take on how that landed? Like, how do you think it landed with the general public? Do you think they saw it? Like, have they seen that actually that it's, Labour being sensible because the Tories have crashed the economy? Or is it, that they can't agree on any policy, they don't actually stand for anything, all this flip-flop stuff? Where do you feel like readers have landed?
I think it's a bit of a mixed picture. I think you're right that it was going on for so long and there was so much flip-flopping and back and forth and negative briefing that I think quite a lot of people in Labour are sort of fairly relieved that it's just been dealt with, just to kind of, get rid of the albatross sort of hanging around. I think in terms of the way they sold it, there is some suggestion, there is some evidence anecdotally, and I think you can see in the way that it was covered that their explanation for the fact that the economic situation is very different, I do think people accept that. And I think in general, lobby journalists, people in Westminster get very preoccupied with U-turns being a sign of weakness and it being a real sort of, a real failure. Whereas actually quite a lot of the time you'll see in focus grouping and polling that the public don't really mind U-turns as long as the solution is more sensible, and I think you could see where Streeting went on Question Time the day of that they finally dumped the 28 billion, and he made a sort of he's quite a good communicator anyway, but he made a fairly convincing sort of stab at saying the Tories have wrecked the economy, we just can't afford this, this is where we are. And I thought it was quite interesting. He got some applause and some sort of nodding and from the audience. I think some people just, they look at their own finances, they look at their own work and they think, okay, well, if we can't afford it, we can't do it. That's fine. So I think there is some of that. I also think there is an issue with the fact that there is a sort of consistent feeling that you see played out, whether it's true or not, that Labour U-turn a lot, and also no one knows what Keir Starmer stands for, even though Labour argue that they've actually set out quite a lot of policy and quite a lot of detail. That is not resonating completely. If you ask the average voter what Labour stands for, I think people sometimes struggle a bit because it's quite broad brush, it's quite big vision, a lot of the mission stuff. And the £28 billion commitment was one of the few really big, concrete, ambitious ideas that was very different from what the Conservatives are offering. So I think that is still a risk that sticks in people's minds. And I do believe that Labour still have some work to do to really convince the public of what their offer is.
Interesting. I mean, well, on that front, going, ahead of the election, what do you think we can expect from all of the parties, really, in terms of how much they will be willing to come out on policies? Because there's been a lot going on about whether Labour will stick to its private school tax stuff, whether the Conservatives are purely going to go on this battle of ideas that they won't need to produce any more policy. It's perfectly clear after 14 years what they stand for. To what extent do you think that's true? And to what extent do you think that policies, the smaller parties, so the SNP and Lib Dems, who are going to have, they're polling increasingly well, what does that mean? What role do they have to play going to the election?
I think the smaller parties definitely have a role to play. You can see that, Reform are obviously something that is the Nigel Farage's founded outlet are obviously playing very heavily on the minds of Conservatives, particularly the right wing of the party. They don't have a lot of policy, but they will. Oh, I appear to have lost the light, but I'll carry on. They will shift the party in a certain direction, and I think with the Liberal Democrats as well, you'll see. We've not been hearing quite so much from them recently, but you will see that they will put pressure on Labour to do things in other directions as well. So, I think they will play a role there. And the SNP as well, you can see that they're already putting pressure. They're calling an opposition day vote in Parliament on Wednesday on Gaza, which is obviously basically designed to make Labour look bad. So all of those parties will be playing a role. I think Labour will probably, they say that they want their manifesto to be quite slim. And it's hard to tell at the moment whether some of it's an expectations game or not, because people I speak to sometimes say, oh, you've seen all our policies. And I think, how can that be possible? How is that? But, certain areas, there's more detail than others. I think things like home affairs, there's quite a lot of quite meaty stuff out there, whereas other briefs, maybe education, they've said, oh, we want to make a big offer on childcare, but they haven't really told us what it is. Yeah. So I think it will become clearer nearer the time, but I think Labour are very concerned about their ideas being stolen by the Conservatives, which has happened in the past. And the Conservatives, I'm not 100% clear on their sort of policy ideas, because they've very much narrowed everything down so that they will, very much focusing on immigration, Rwanda, and cost of living, the economy, and that's about it. They've not really talked about everything else. So I don't know whether that's just for now. They don't have the bandwidth to deal with anything else. And when the election comes, they'll have to say what they want to do. But I think the idea of them fighting the election on their record would be a gamble, considering how badly they're polling.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting. I mean, just as a final kind of aside, I mean, ignoring, say, the mudslinging around the 28 billion and how that happened, how much do you think environment and environmental type issues could feature to the next election? So obviously we know that things like sewage really cut through to the public. Do you think that will the media be interested? Will political parties continue to, we had Steve Reed over the weekend talking about a ban on fox hunting. So it's like really appealing to a very specific pool of voters. Can you see that like countryside and nature and things like sewage will have any kind of cut through?
I think so. I think you'll certainly see, as you were saying with Steve Reed, and certainly with the Liberal Democrats as well, that they're very aggressively trying to chase rural voters and trying to make a case for the fact that they're not just sort of urban centric parties. So I think you will see some of that. And the Conservatives obviously have some sort of natural territory there where they've sort of been more embedded in some rural communities than perhaps Labour have. So I think that will certainly continue to play out. And you're right that nature and water quality, I think all of the parties were taken aback by the level of intensity of feeling around sewage. I think was it last year or the year before, there was a vote in Parliament where I think they were really surprised by how angry people were. And so I think the Conservatives know that they're vulnerable on that. The Liberal Democrats have made a big virtue of going for it. So I think that will continue to be an issue. But I think the main thing is that that the election is going to be looked at through a prism of cost of living. And so environmental policies we've seen have fallen foul of this. And the Conservatives have made it quite clear that they're not particularly interested in net zero. They're not particularly, they see that as, they've tried to present that as being a tax on people, anything to do with, and they've rode back on so many commitments, environmental commitments. I think Labour are more interested in that, but they've got themselves into a difficult position where they don't want to, so now that the Conservatives have presented it as a cost of living issue, they don't want to say, well, we want to add money to your bills. And their main vehicle for saying we're going to create clean energy and all of this, they've had to take an axe to. So their attempts to sort of say, well, we're going to transform the economy and green it whilst keeping jobs and all of that, now have some holes in. So I'm not sure exactly how they're going to resolve it. But Keir Starmer did make making Britain a clean energy superpower one of his missions. So he can't get away from that. So I'm sure there will be people who will hold his feet to the fire on it, but it is a balance, I think, and I'm not 100% convinced that there might not be further U-turns in this area.
Really interesting. I mean, I think this is a good point to also bring in Jess from ECIU, because talking about, the implications of what it meant for in Labour's dropping 28 billion and what's coming up and like what actually is left, in terms of like the warm homes plan, that is something that insulating our homes and looking at, heat pumps as alternatives, it has been so vilified across it in the media of like what that looks like. Cost of living is like central to all of this. I don't know if Jess, you want to just come in a bit on like, what do you think the biggest threats are? What is left? Is there a chance that probably we will lose it? And where does that leave, environmental NGOs and civil society?
Yeah, thanks. Big question. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Lizzie, Holly. Really interesting. I suppose I do agree with you, Holly, that the major thing that was cut around the 28 billion, now not 28 billion, was the warm homes plan. And when I was speaking to the industry, not just the energy efficiency industry, but the energy sector more widely, including things like energy companies, you talk to the environmental NGOs, like you mentioned, journalists, even politicians, they were all asking, why have they cut this part of the plan, given that it's one of the most sensible things that we can do? And I say that because insulation, it's not even really about carbon emissions anymore. Insulation is about reducing our gas demand, getting our energy independent. It's about reducing bills. Obviously, the cost of living, as you guys just mentioned, is a huge factor in this. And the cost of living has been driven, but in the majority, by expensive gas. Expensive gas has put up our energy bills. It's put up our food bills because gas is used to make fertilizer, which then obviously goes into the food system. And it's driven up basically the cost of virtually everything, to the point where we're now in a cost of living crisis. And the things that can help us with getting away from this high cost of living are actually reducing our gas demand and our gas exposure basically in the first place. And that's through things like insulation, which has now been cut. And I think that there's actually quite a lot of confusion from the energy sector around what Labour's policies are now, because the number one thing that when you speak to investors they ask for is policy stability and certainty, long-term stability basically. And they had that with the 28 billion. They had that with the clean energy grid by 2030, and Labour is still committed to that. But I think what the U-turn or the policy rollback or whatever you want to call it has done has just created more uncertainty in a market now where the UK is not the only player. We've got the US and the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got the EU, individual countries, and the EU as a bloc really wanting to invest in green solutions, things like offshore wind. And now the UK is competing not only with those two superpowers, but also with the likes of China for offshore wind resources is one example, but also for lots of different supply chains. So the UK is potentially in a situation where it's not as attractive to invest here anymore. And further rollbacks, like Lizzy was saying, does really have the potential to not only harm the voters, but also harm the energy sector's confidence. And these large multinational companies are not just going to put money into the UK because we asked for it. You know, they need to have the policy stability and the certainty of returns, which now they might not get.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, it's really hard to know. I mean, we will come on to this a bit more with our next two panelists as well about where this now sits and arguments around the economy and, you know, Labour moving away from the idea of borrowing to invest, and whether that has cut through on, you know, the Conservatives saying that there's just nothing we can do. I mean, what do you think the biggest things coming up are? Obviously, we've got things like the offshore petroleum licensing bill this week. Do you feel like there are big moments yet to come that will kind of put a spotlight on this stuff? Like, where is the hope? Where is the future in like environmental issues and campaigning as we go to the election?
Yeah, I think when you look at what's already happened in the election campaign so far, obviously net zero has been a huge part of that, energy, climate issues. Like Lizzy was saying, the Conservatives have tended to move away from seeing net zero in a positive light and are talking about pragmatic and affordable, those sorts of words, instead of the likes of Boris Johnson, who were very much talking up net zero and talking up the UK's climate credentials. We've been on a real journey since 2020, 2021, when people were talking about green recovery from COVID. The UK hosted COP26 in Glasgow. Boris Johnson was saying, we want to be the Saudi Arabia of wind. We want to have 8 nuclear power stations in 8 years. These sorts of pledges. Then we had Liz Truss, who obviously was crazy, chaotic voting around fracking, which ultimately brought her down essentially as Prime Minister. And then since then we've had Rishi, who is a lot more measured in talking about net zero, says they're committed to it, but then again rolls back on all the policies that were put in place to achieve it. Things like energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector, they were scrapped altogether. Electric vehicle phase out pushed back 5 years, gas boiler phase out potentially pushed back, no one's quite sure. So since 2020, 2021, there's really been a shift from the Conservative Party. And when you look at the same time frame for Labour, there's not been nearly as much of a shift. So when people talk about Labour doing all these U-turns, actually, on balance, the Conservatives have had more U-turns when it comes to net zero stuff. But that's not to say that Labour are completely out of the woods. We've got things like the Clean Power 2030 mission, which obviously Keir Starmer said is one of his 5 priorities. And I think that lots of the energy sector is basically looking at the Labour pledge, which is clean power by 2030, and comparing it to the Conservative pledge, which is 95% clean power by 2030. And I think a lot of them are saying, well, actually, people are arguing over a few percent. Whether it's 95%, 100%, it still requires a real shift in the energy system to achieve either of those aims, right? You have to build out lots more offshore wind and solar. You have to sort out the grid. You have to get things like connections really sped up so that people can actually put these renewable projects online, battery storage. All of these areas are actually areas of potential growth. But I think at the moment, the Conservatives certainly aren't viewing them as areas of growth. I think Labour are more, they're talking a lot more about investment and jobs still. But yeah, not on the same kinds of levels that they were talking on. So you've got the Clean Power Mission, but you've also got lots of things around steel probably going to be in the news. We're expecting some more announcements from the steel and industrial clusters that we still have left. We've got energy efficiency, which has fallen off the radar. And like you mentioned, heat pumps, which are certainly being talked about a lot by politicians and media. And it's quite strange, actually, because in Europe, the narrative on heat pumps is completely different. And the narrative that's pushed by manufacturers, who quite often heat pump manufacturers are also gas boiler manufacturers. And in different countries, so I'm comparing the UK to, say, the likes of Germany, the narratives that are being pushed by these companies are completely different. So there's a strange dynamic around that. But at the end of the day, if you want energy independence, you've got to get off gas, because as the North Sea continues its decline, then unless we reduce our demand for gas, then we're just going to have to import more from abroad. And new licenses will make very little difference because there's simply not that much left in the North Sea.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, in a sense, do you take any positive from the fact that, like the last party conferences, there was such a spotlight on energy issues to such a niche degree that you had, like, 3 of the major people at Labour Party conference standing up and talking about grid connections. That is very unique. That's not something that would normally be mainstreamed. I was on the train home with journalists from conference being like, so what? Can you explain it? Like, what does that mean? Why would it matter? Like, people can't sell that on the doorstep. So, like, the fact that Labour feel empowered to even have those conversations on a national level, do you take heart in that, and that at least there are conversations happening about it?
I think that's a really good point, because if you look at what's happened in the past, like 2 years since, it'll be 2 years next week when Ukraine was first invaded, and energy security has been top of the agenda for lots of politicians of all varying shades and colours, basically, saying that energy security is the #1 priority, getting our energy independence back. And you simply cannot get energy independence while you're reliant on oil and gas. It's just not possible as the UK, because we don't have enough of our own reserves. So I think if there hadn't been the war, this perhaps wouldn't have even been on the agenda. So I think you're right that there's been a huge focus on it, and a huge focus, not just from really nerdy techie people like me, but from people who've never heard of grid connections before and didn't know about the issues that we have with the queue, and various other things. And I think that it's really put the spotlight on these very niche issues, like you say. And I think that they are more and more being talked about, not only in sort of elite conversations between politicians, but also around the dinner table. My parents have never been so interested in what I do, to be quite frank. So I think that there's going to be lots more debate about these issues. And now that Labour has cut back on its £28 billion pledge, there's obviously less money to deliver the same mission of clean power. And so they're really going to have to look at things like regulation, sorting out the planning system, all of those things which are free to costing very little, in order to be able to achieve their mission for a lower cost.
Yeah, definitely. Well, fascinating. Well, I mean, as good a point as any to bring in Sam from Public First. I mean, Jess and I just touched on it then about Labour boxing themselves in on the economy, right? And we've got the budget in a couple of weeks. Labour have pledged, then they will borrow to invest much less than they had planned because of what the government have done. I don't want this all to be just a conversation about Labour. And obviously there are big things that we can expect. People on all sides of the debate have a lot of expectations of what will come in the budget. You've got people in the Conservative Party wanting massive tax cuts as an offer to the public, right? Seems like after the recession figures last week, that is much less likely than maybe it once was. What do you see? What do you think we can expect from budget? It's on the 6th of March. We're on a bit of a countdown. Can you give us a download on what you think is most likely to be in it?
Yeah, so I mean, all budgets are political, right? But this one is especially weird because we don't know whether it's our last one before the election or whether Jeremy Hunt is going to try and squeeze in another couple. That is partly hinging on the election date. It's partly dependent on him rolling the dice and seeing how much space he has to do some of the more political things. So the Tories are currently caught between a rock and a hard place, to be honest, in that the OBR have said that we are averaging the lowest amount of fiscal headroom, the amount that government has in theory to spend against its fiscal rules for the past 30 years. And that means that government is at the mercy of OBR forecasts. They can do what OBR says they have space for. But at the same time, in the run up to the election, the Conservatives are desperate to show a little bit of fiscal ankle and be like, look, there is stuff you can get from a Conservative government. And that predominantly has revolved around tax cuts. The issue they've had is that tax cuts over the past 14 years have not done anything for the economy. They've not raised revenues. And we are also, you can trim at the margins, but we are at the highest tax burden for decades. Like, people are paying more tax than they ever have. And I think the other thing that the Tories are looking to do is the problem with Labour saying, yes, we've rode back on some of our promises. We also don't think there's any money left. We will stick with Tory plans on various tax cuts, on full expensing, is that gives the Conservatives all the power. So if they want to salt the earth, if they want to bind Labour in, then they can. That might be leaving as little fiscal headroom as possible, so spend right up to the limit to get debt falling. It might be ditching some policies. So we've seen that the clean heat mechanism is possibly on the way out for heat pumps, or it might be extending policies that are currently due to end in, say, 2027, 2028, something like full expensing or their energy efficiency plans even further. So Labour goes, okay, well, then now our plans to the end of the Parliament. And I think the point that kind of gets missed in the debate, although you saw that it's in some of Jeremy Hunt's throwbacks over the weekend, is that, like, the existing plans, the OBR have called fiscal fiction. Like, they just don't add up. They apply implausible levels of cuts to unprotected departments. So particularly justice, looking at like a 40% tax cut in the next Parliament after 14 years of successive cuts. So the idea that whoever turns up in after the next election is going to have to implement them is just, I think, beyond reality.
I mean, everything you're saying makes total sense. And I mean, obviously everyone is aware that the economic picture is fairly bleak right now, but where specifically, looking at like the climate and nature agenda, where does that leave us? Because if we're, people much more reticent to borrow to invest because it costs much more, but we have a vast amount that we know needs to be done, and it cannot just be done. We need government investment in order to stimulate business investment, etc. Where do you think the arguments are best placed to try and make that argument to all parties, big and small?
So I think the first argument you need to make before we get to borrow and invest is, have you done everything that doesn't require public spending? So have you maxed out all your regulatory ambition? And that can be things like shifting your policy costs, for example, from electricity onto gas. It can be things like, actually, the autumn statement came out with their connections action plan. So all the stuff that you were just talking to Jess about, the grid, like that sort of stuff is underway, and it's great. Potentially there's some stuff that you can do to Ofgem, the energy regulator. But once you've exhausted that bucket of things, then we have to turn to public spending and be like, okay, so how does government money potentially move the dial even faster? And we can think about the range of things that climate change is forcing us to have to confront. So that might be increasing our flood resilience, that might be building out energy infrastructure a bit faster, and there may therefore be some role of public finance in spending on the grid, which we've been slow to update. Otherwise, it all goes on bills, right? But there is also, I think, often mixed a bucket of stuff that we need to spend money on because we've not spent money on it in like 30 years. And that's where the water comes in. We haven't built any new reservoirs. All these sort of things that are just a product of underinvestment generally. At some point, we're going to have to turn around and go, there needs to be a way of us updating these, and we need to have a conversation. Is like, would we prefer the government to spend that and use it through general taxation, which means it gets distributed evenly across the population, but we're going to potentially have to find a revenue source, or we're going to have to do government borrowing? The alternative when it comes to water or electricity is that it goes on bills, which means somebody is paying for it, but potentially slightly less popular than government paying for it directly.
Okay, really interesting. I mean, back to the kind of broader politics around the spring budget. I mean, what do you think the public care? Do you think that they're looking at, what Hunt is going to announce? Like, does that matter to ordinary people? Like, there's 6 months, probably left of this Parliament. If they're not going to make any real announcements on, income tax that will actually make a difference to people's pockets, are people going to be listening to this, or is this just a bit of a bubble conversation?
So I think there's a couple of aspects to this. So the first point is I, in my role, get to spend a lot of time in focus groups, which is a fantastic way of sort of testing the public mood or the mood of various groups. The one message that comes out of all of those groups is like, this is as bad as it's been. Like, people are desperate on a personal level, but they're also fairly desperate about the state of the country. And they are willing to put a vote in somebody who is got a really clear plan on how to change that. So the first thing is the public will pay attention because they want to know how things are going to get better, and they will assess what government or Labour have said if it's a credible way of delivering that future change. So the argument that Tories are going to have to make is, if they take a penny off income tax, if they can afford that, is okay, how does reducing a penny on income tax solve all the problems that people are seeing day to day? And I think that disconnect between credibility and outcome is the real challenge for the government. But I mean, in terms of like, are people paying attention to the wider stuff? Broadly, no. There is more of an anti-politics feel in general, that nobody is able to do anything that we've seen in a while. But where it does matter is both on like how it forces, what the government do, how it forces Labour to respond, and what that means for their plans. And it matters for the mood music going into the short campaign of like 6 weeks before the election, when people do start to pay attention. And if you have this backlog of policies which starts to lay out your narrative of like, the next 5 years under this political party mean X, Y, Z, then that's why actually the decisions made in this budget matter both for people and for the potential political response.
Yeah, really interesting. I wonder if, quickly, Lizzy, if you're still around. I mean, what do you agree with Sam's take on that? Do you agree with his take on whether the public are actually listening and whether those are right and what we're expecting from the budget?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's, I think Westminster heavily prices events like this in, and the budget is a huge moment for us, for politicians. But actually, one of the issues that the Conservatives have had is that they cut national insurance, but people haven't really felt it, really. And there is so much, that they did that. They used all their kind of political capital and some of that space to do it. They've not really got the credit for it. And now they keep talking about tax cuts. But one of the things you keep seeing is that actually what people really want quite a lot of the time is investment in public services rather than tax cuts, because there's this wider, as Sam said, this wider sort of sense that things don't work, that you can't get a GP appointment, you can't get a bus, the roads are terrible. There's that sort of overarching feeling. And so I think a lot of the arguments about tax cuts back and forth are often arguments that the Conservatives are having with themselves. And it's sort of sometimes on a kind of party management basis rather than anything else. Obviously, if they can cut taxes, that's what they want to do. But the Treasury were briefing quite heavily that they were going to do it, then started briefing again that they weren't. And who knows over the next couple of weeks what it will be. But I can't, this is a probably the last budget, and they're going to want to make a sort of big bang out of it. But actually, I'm not 100% convinced that I would be avidly watching this if I was a person who wasn't paid to watch it all the time.
Just sorry, Ollie, just one very quick follow-up. Is like, in the conversation to borrow to invest and where the public are at, I think the difficulty both parties have is we're having one conversation on borrowing to invest, and we talk about capital requirements, we're talking about big infrastructure, etc. But if you talk to the public about what they want done, it's public services, which is day-to-day spending, and that is this, like, we don't borrow for day-to-day spending. It's really hard and much more difficult because you're talking about, like, there's no end to that borrowing. We haven't quite managed to square that circle about how borrowing to invest leads to the improvement of like public services and the everyday stuff that people are after.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, well, this is as good a time as any to bring in Steve, because a question has already come up in the chat about fiscal rules, and obviously we've had a lot of interest in fiscal rules because Keir and Rachel have made a really big point of talking about fiscal rules, and that everything that they do, if Labour were in government, has to be based on these fiscal rules. But I wonder if, Steve, you can just talk us through a little bit about like what the fiscal rules are. They are incredibly political, and how can they fit much better, as to the question in the chat, to nature and environment, because at the moment they are not incorporated, they are not one and the same.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone. Really, really interesting so far. I mean, just for sort of context, I mean, obviously we're all very depressed that the GPP is being dropped. It's a massive shot in the foot as well. You know, we're in recession. We've had subpar growth for the last 15 years, really since before the financial crash. And one of the main reasons for that is we don't really invest. The IFS Resolution Foundation has said a large part of the problem which precedes Brexit is that we simply don't invest. Res Foundation crunches the numbers, said had we invested at even the OECD average over the last 15 years, we would have put £500 billion more into investment than we actually did. In other words, there's a £500 billion of investment that's missing. And I think you can see it when you look around in the sort of crappy state of infrastructure. And Green Alliance has calculated that had we actually invested this stuff in renewables, for example, we could have built 150 gigawatts of renewable capacity. Had we invested that money, that would have made us, for example, one of the largest net energy exporters in Europe. That would have done wonders for the balance of payments, produced a lot of tax revenues and lower bills. So when the conversation is about growth or lack of it, you know, exhibit A is the lack of investment. So as far as the fiscal rules go, I think Labour's problem all along was that it could almost have its fiscal rules, which are quite tight. They're deliberately quite tight because international markets, not to mention domestic opinion, always imposes higher penalties on left-wing government. It just doesn't trust them enough, ironically, given what we've seen with Lid Trust. But that's a fact of life. So Labour has tough fiscal rules. It also wanted to have its green prosperity plan. And the trouble is they were pretty tight, Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules. One of them, the rule on debt, sustainability, was that you could only start investing, even if it's pro-growth investment, you could only start doing this once debt was falling as a share of GDP. The OBR's last prediction was that this wouldn't have happened until 2028, which is the penultimate year of the parliament. So I think underlying this was a calculation of, well, why die in a ditch over this when we can't actually even do this until towards the end of the parliament? So the fiscal rules are a problem. They have to go. Politically, Labour can't do anything, can't say anything about them before the election. After the election, all bets are off. And so we're urging Labour to rethink its fiscal rules, because there's a large body of opinion that says fiscal rules we've had all along up till now, including Labour's, anti-investment. They're short-termist. They prioritise day-to-day spending over investment. As Sam and Lizzy have pointed out, it's politically quite difficult to say, well, we might have to borrow a bit more for a rainy day in the future. But this short-termism and this politicisation of public investment and the paraphernalia of policy around them, which includes the fiscal rules, are a dire problem for all this. So we think Labour should rethink its fiscal rules. They're actually very good alternatives, rather than the sort of tightness that it has now. It can introduce, for example, a green fiscal rule. So New Labour had a specific fiscal rule for investments, so it was excluded from many of the calculations on the fiscal rule. We think there should be a similar carve-out for green investment. There are also other measures. You could, for example, have a mandate to increase the size of public sector net wealth, so increase the sort of stock of capital there is in the economy. You can include green capital among this. There could be a mandate to sort of grow the size of green capital, grow the sort of value of green capital. At the moment, and this was pointed out by the Desgupta review that was commissioned by the Treasury a couple of years ago, on which we're doing some research, nature is not actually valued properly in economics. Actually, nature is only valued when it's destroyed to be made into something else. There's no intrinsic value that's actually attached to nature. So there's obviously no incentive for politicians to spend any money to try and preserve nature. So that's one thing that could be very useful. The investment in renewables and all the other green stuff, that's actually very pro-growth. So one of the problems with the fiscal rules, so Labour's fiscal rules, for example, were predicated on the idea that, yes, they recognised that investment was pro-growth, but because of this restriction on debt, you couldn't actually put in the pro-growth measures until you had growth. So it's a rather sort of circular way of dealing with the issue of, or dealing with the sort of potential for investment to kickstart growth. So if they have a large enough, a reasonable size parliamentary majority after the election, they will probably have the sort of political and fiscal space to start rethinking these things. Because at the moment, in place of the GPP, there's now more emphasis on things like GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund, which are great ideas, but they're going to be slow burners. The GB Energy, for example, as a sort of government sort of VC kind of thing to put capital into promising energy projects and sort of socialize some of the gains from that, rather than that always go into the private sector. Great idea. Lots of other countries do it, but you're not going to see much payoff initially. That's going to be very much a slow burner. Ditto the National Wealth Fund, which is really just a sort of much smaller version of the GPP and given a specific name. As we don't have lots of fiscal space, as we don't have a sort of big balance of payments export, big balance of payments surplus, the money has to come from borrowing, which is exactly what the GPP was supposed to be doing. So Labour has good plans. I can see why it was politically difficult for it to carry on with the GPP, given that it probably clashed with its own fiscal rules. But I'm hoping it sort of rethinks a lot of this stuff after the election, you know, assuming there is a Labour government. If there isn't a Labour government, if the Conservatives hang on, not really clear what their way forward is for green spending, as Sam has pointed out. They want to use the maximum amount of fiscal space for tax cuts. That's good for their burnishing their image as tax cutters when they've been tax raisers. It also hems in Labour, because then the Conservatives can say, well, you got your green prosperity plan. We have tax cuts. Voters, which do you prefer? Very, very difficult space for Labour to be in. It's not really clear whether they have any plans for, after a general election, were they to win it. Rishi's government tends to put much more emphasis on private sector investment in nature. Private sector has most of the money, so this is sensible, but it often needs the public sector, public investment to sort of kickstart this stuff. Private sector investors are often quite risk averse. They don't like to invest in very heavy infrastructure, which their rivals and their competitors can use. There's an enormous role for the government as sort of kickstarter and prime mover. So you do need public investment, but you also need to find clever ways of incentivizing the private sector to get involved. So Labour, if it wins, will need to rethink its fiscal rules. The Conservatives, if they win, I think will need to rethink their entire approach to green investment, because they don't really seem to take it very seriously.
Right, no small feat on both counts. Really useful overview. Thank you so much. Can I just encourage everyone actually to turn their cameras back on, and I'm going to do some quick fire Q&A, because there are a few interesting questions. So please do, you know, anyone listening, please do put some questions in the chat if you're interested. Something you want to know. I mean, I feel like I know the answer to this, but I will ask it anyway. Maybe Lizzy and Sam, most appropriate for you. I mean, someone has asked, what is the scope for shifting the burden of taxation to a wealth tax? So something more proportionate, council tax, residential land. You know, I could answer this myself, but I will go to the experts. Lizzy, what do you think? Do you think the public have appetite for something like that, or do you think politicians do?
I think there's certainly appetite in the public. I think there's very limited political appetite to do that. I think Labour have been very resistant to sort of suggesting that they would increase taxes really in any way. And obviously, you know, they are talking about some of the bigger picture stuff. They're very sort of, you know, they say they don't want to increase taxes on working people, basically. So I think that's probably quite unlikely, and it doesn't sound like the government are particularly keen either. I mean, there's been quite a lot of conversation more broadly about council tax in particular. Is like, does it really work? Are the thresholds fair? Is it right that it's based on sort of 1990s valuations? But every time those things are raised, I've not seen anyone running with it, particularly from either party. So you never know. I think when you poll, I can't remember the last time that was done, but I think polling generally around wealth taxes there tends to be some public support for that, but I've not heard a lot of support on the political side.
Do you agree with that, Sam?
Yeah, broadly. I think, I mean, look, Labour has ruled out every tax under the sun apart from a windfall tax, and that is because the most popular thing you can poll at the moment, basically, other than actually support for onshore wind, is like, are energy companies bad people? Should we get them to pay more money? So Labour goes, yes, please, we'll take some more money from them. I mean, I think there's a broader point, less so on the wealth tax, which I wouldn't be hanging my hopes on, but I do think there's a lot of scope when both, either if it's Tories or Labour, get in the next election. The OBR forecast is another 5 years away, and they sit down and go, actually, this is completely terrible. We need to start again, and we need to find some sustainable sources of revenue. If that's going to happen, it happens at the beginning of a parliament rather than the end of it. So if we're looking for any new taxes or tax changes, they'll come early and maybe quietly.
Okay, interesting. Well, we've got another question about how we can get more effective at quantifying the benefits of climate and nature investment. So like how you can tell the story of how it improves people's health, reduces their bills. You know, nature itself does poll incredibly well that people do see the value in having nature close to them. They want parks close to them. They want people to have access to that kind of thing. But is there actual political capital in it? I don't know if Lizzy and Jess, if you'd like to come back on that.
Yeah, I can quickly just point to some evidence that's come out from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which basically says that the costs of not addressing climate change could be much higher than the costs of addressing it. So if there's future gas crises, for example, which isn't even a climate change thing, gas crises could happen because of whatever's happening in the Middle East getting even worse, more geopolitical tensions elsewhere. God forbid China invades Taiwan, things like that. Those sorts of things will send oil and gas costs soaring. And if the UK doesn't move away from using those sources of energy, then we're going to be just as vulnerable to future shocks as we were to the shock of the invasion of Ukraine. But the Office of Budget Responsibility says that if we see more future gas crises and our reliance on those fuels stays the same, then we could add 10% of debt, 10% of GDP to our debt by 2030. So our debt could get much worse, basically. And that's just through the cost of not doing sensible things like insulating our homes, building out more renewables, moving to electric vehicles, stuff like that. So there's costs of not doing these things, I guess is the point I'm making.
Definitely. Lizzy, do you feel like it's something you could sell to readers, like to the general public?
I think Jess is right about the cost of not doing stuff. I think voters do understand that. And I think what is difficult, because we're in this like final throes of this parliament, is that no one wants to take the hit on anything. No one wants to take the short-term pain for long-term gain on any policy, really. And so that's why partly why you've seen lots of policies fall by the wayside. I think our readers certainly did get it around, the energy security issue around Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, around what's going on in the Middle East. I think our readers do understand that. And I think there was quite a lot of appetite, certainly at the start of the kind of after the Russian invasion, for, there was support for government policies of trying to remove reliance on Russian oil and gas. Obviously, we're not as reliant as some other European countries, but I think that is something that people do understand. And I do think also that I sometimes wonder whether Westminster underprices the support that the public have for climate-friendly policies. That politicians always look at things through a cost of living prism, and that is right. Cost of living is the thing that bothers people most. But also people, net zero is a sort of settled question in voters' minds in a lot of ways. Lots of people do think about the environment and do care about it. And especially if you're trying to engage younger voters who are very preoccupied by the climate crisis, I think there are ways to sell this sort of thing, certainly. And obviously we're in a place at the moment where this parliament has been absolutely marked by crisis after crisis after crisis, which has meant there's very limited space for sort of being thoughtful on anything kind of more longer term. And you've seen very short-termist ideas on almost every policy area. But you would be hopeful that perhaps in the next parliament, whether it is the Conservatives or Labour, that perhaps maybe there will be a bit more space to think in a more long-term way. Might be a bit wishful thinking, but
Just just to follow up on public opinion, I think when, as climate advocates, we are just spending a lot of time dealing with Westminster, we try and overthink and over-justify everything. And what matters is credibility and tangibility. And to the public, they want to do climate change because they care about climate change. They're worried about extreme weather and they're worried about future generations. They want to do nature because they like nature. They want to do energy because they want the energy more secure, and they've seen the war in Ukraine. Like, it doesn't really get more complicated than that. And I think when you get into, we have to do nature because we need to save the NHS money and there's mental health and wider health benefits. One, it takes a bit more explaining for it to be intuitive to a wider public. But two, it leads you to a policy credibility point. It's like, okay, if we're saving the NHS 4 billion a year, are we cutting the NHS budget by 4 billion a year and taking that back and spending it on something else? Because in which case we're not, like, that saving never materializes, right? It's not tangible enough. And I think we can sometimes overthink where the public are because we spend a lot of time talking to MPs who layer their own opinions on top.
Just want to pick up on something that Lizzy said, which I thought was a really good point and really interesting, is that no politicians are willing to make these longer term decisions because they're worried about the short term. But it struck me as ironic because Rishi's tagline is literally long term decisions for a better future. So there's quite clearly a disconnect between what they say and what they mean. I mean, that's not telling anyone anything new, but yeah, just interesting.
Definitely. And I think that is an appropriate place to call it to a close. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all on. Thank you so much for all of your insights. We are in for a bit of a bumpy ride to the election, I think. We plan to keep doing these election webinars every month to the election because there is an awful lot going on. And as the narrative changes substantially, we'll try and keep ahead of it, and we'll get hopefully another lobby journalist back next time. But thank you all so much for your time, and thank you for everyone for coming.